Hi, Right Writers with Cruz here. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, we're going to be focusing on allegory, and I highly recommend that you review a video that we created on illusion. And that video will help you so much make the connection between what we are doing here and what we did in a previous video on illusion, where we use the exact same poem, just looking for a different literary device. In that video, using Phyllis Wheatley's poem on being brought from Africa to America, in that video, we looked at illusion. In this video, we're going to be looking at allegory. And part of the reason I wanted to use her poem for both of these examples of literary devices, because it just worked really well, and it allows you as a writer to sort of see that transition and understand that many times literary devices are connected. And so just understand that that's part of the reasoning behind it. And I believe that it will ensure your success in not only watching this video on allegory, but then also the previous video on illusion to help you see that connection. So as we normally begin with a definition, we want to start again with a very basic surface level definition of what exactly is allegory. What does that really mean? And so I like to do a super basic definition so we understand clearly what we are talking about. So in this case, when we say the word allegory, I want you to think of basically any work at all, whether it be art, artistic, a song, a poem, writing, anything. So any work where a hidden meaning is revealed, or any work, you could say, any work reveals, or any work revealing, or reveals a hidden meaning. A work reveals a hidden meaning. And so if you're thinking about allegory, and using it as a noun, if we were using it as an adjective, we could change the suffix and say that the work is allegorical. So allegorical is the adjective, and then we have the allegory, which serves as the noun. So just keep that in mind, right, writers? But it's basically a work that reveals a hidden meaning, but it's a little bit more than that. It's not just, you might ask, well, what kind of hidden meaning? And that's exactly what we need to talk about next and go deeper in this definition. Well, it could be some sort of moral lesson or meaning. It could be some religious lesson or meaning. It could be a social lesson or meaning. It could also be a political lesson or a meaning behind it. So again, there's something that's hidden. It's implied, meaning you're like a detective trying to figure out what is being said, but it's hidden and it's implied. And so it has some sort of moral lesson, religious lesson, a social lesson, or a political lesson of some sort. Please keep in mind that allegories can be, thinking about it from an adjective, that adjective meaning allegorical, but allegories, you can say, tend to be both, you can say, metaphorical and also symbolic. So they have metaphors, they have symbolism within it. And so again, these are multiple literary devices that are being used at one time to help to create this message, this meaning. And so that is why allegory is a more challenging literary device, because it's almost like you need the background knowledge of other literary devices like metaphor, like symbolism, in order to pick up on these allegories. So we could say that allegories tend to be both metaphorical, so just think metaphors, and symbolic. So think symbolism. So keep that in mind, right, writers, as we're thinking about allegories. Just again, keep in mind that they tend to be both metaphorical and symbolic. And again, it'll start to reveal itself once you become more comfortable with other literary devices. And we're going to see this in the work that we have to the left of our screen. So on the left side of the screen, we've got our poem, thanks to the Poetry Foundation. Our poem by Phyllis Wheatley. Keep in mind, I want you to go back in time, and we're looking at the late 1700s here as we look at this particular work by Phyllis Wheatley. And the title is On Being Brought from Africa to America. So let's take a look at our poem. We're going to read it a few times. The first thing I'm going to do, though, before I do that, is I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste my link so I don't lose it. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I have the title before we begin reading, and I want to ensure my success, so I want to make sure the capitalization is correct and that everything is written exactly as Phyllis Wheatley had intended. I think the other thing that I want to make sure that I do, because I even catch myself making this mistake, and that is making sure that I write the writer's name correctly. Many times, we'll put down someone's name and spell it incorrectly, and we want to make sure that we respect the people that we are using text evidence from. We want to respect their name and spelling it correctly and spelling it the way that they had intended. So you will see that that will be important as well. All right, let's take a look at our poem by Phyllis Wheatley, and let's begin. On Being Brought from Africa to America. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. Let's go ahead and take that from the top again. On Being Brought from Africa to America by Phyllis Wheatley. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. So if you, like me, are, seeing this one stanza poem and are thinking to yourself, well, let's see, is there a moral lesson, a religious lesson, a social lesson, a political lesson of some sort? And if you're thinking to yourself, Cruz, I kind of think the whole thing is an allegory. And I would say, yes, I agree with you. There is no doubt that this particular work is allegorical. So we've got our allegory right here. And if you think about it, the definition itself, which is why I pulled it up here on the right of the screen, you see that it is a work. So it's almost as if the entire work must represent that hidden meaning. And if you're picking up on moral lessons, social lessons, or religious lessons, then we are on the same page, right, writers? Because I am too. I agree with you. And if you're seeing something different, then I encourage you to write your paragraph, and I'm excited to see what you come up with. And please share that in the comments section and tell us, give us your interpretation here. But as far as I'm concerned, how I'm reading this poem, there's no doubt for me that I notice an allegorical message. And so if, again, I'm using this allegorical as an adjective, I've got to make sure that I've got a noun modifying it. And so again, now there's an allegorical message, no doubt, that Phyllis Wheatley has in this particular work. And so now we will construct our middle school paragraph, but what's interesting is before we do that, we need the text evidence. But here's the catch, right, writers? We are actually going to use the entire work. So the entire work is going to serve as the text evidence. So this particular video is going to be a little bit different from ones that we've done in the past, because in this case, again, the entire work will be used. So in order to use the text evidence, I'm going to go ahead and I want to make sure that I copy everything. So I'm going to Control C. I'm going to hit Control V. Keep in mind, this is a one stanza poem, and this poem has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines. So we've got an 8-line, one stanza, 8-line poem. And so we want to kind of include that there. And we're going to go ahead and copy the entire work from Phyllis Wheatley. So now I'm going to go ahead and maximize this screen so we can see it. And so one of the questions you might have is, okay, so we have the entire work. How do you put that in a paragraph? How do you make it, and include it and make sure that that this is presented in the right way? And so we're going to do that right here. We're going to do it directly underneath it. So we are borrowing the entire text evidence. So here, before we begin though, let's go ahead and actually, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Let's go ahead and sort of highlight and identify where we might see moral lessons, religious lesson, social lesson in some way. So thinking about, again, moral, religious, or social lessons. So I'm going to move this down so we can have this a little bit more here and we can see this. So we have this idea of a moral lesson. We have religious lesson, and you could call it a social lesson. Again, we can choose to separate or we can try to sort of put it together. So in thinking about the first lines of her poem, Phyllis Wheatley says, "'Twas mercy. So it was mercy that brought me." And it's almost like you have to insert words in the poem. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land. It was mercy that brought me from my pagan land." So who or what is the pagan land referring to? So if you look at the title, being brought from Africa to America, who or what is the pagan land referring to? If you're thinking to yourself, Africa, yes, you are correct. That is what she is referring to in this case. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too." Okay, so she was brought from one continent into another. You could argue again, the Americas here, from Africa. And so you have this pagan existence, this pagan way of living. And all of a sudden now you recognize that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. So would you call that a religious lesson, a moral lesson, or a social lesson of some sort? So in this case, right, writers, you have the power to make that decision. So for me, I'm going to go ahead and make this, I'm going to say that this is a religious lesson. So lines 1 through 3 for me represent a religious message or a religious lesson. And then I'm going to keep reading. Again, you may have a different opinion, and you may decide that, well, I feel like it's a religion and a moral lesson. That's fine too. Or maybe you just feel like it's a moral lesson. Feel free. Again, you have the power. You're the writer. Do it. You do it your way. do your thing. I'm just here to facilitate and kind of keep you pumped about learning about, these literary devices and sticking by your side here, right, writers. So, all right, now moving on, she says, and again, want to point out first person. She says, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land." So we've got me and my first person point of view. Second line, "Taught my benighted soul," first person, "that there is a God, that there is a Savior too. Once I," first person, "redemption, neither sought nor knew." So neither sought is the past tense of seeking. I did not seek redemption, nor did I know redemption. So once I redemption neither sought nor knew, if we were breaking that down, she's essentially saying I did not know what redemption was, nor did I seek redemption. And so in this case, is this a moral lesson? Would it be a social lesson or a religious lesson? Again, for me, in this part, once I redemption neither sought nor knew. When I think of redemption, this idea of redemption, I think it could be, you could argue that line 4 may be both a moral lesson and religious lesson. And so you could think about it from moral and religious lesson in this one, for me anyway. Again, right, writers, you have the power to make that decision. And then we continue the poem in line 5. "Some view our sable race with scornful eye." So who is she talking about here? Well, there's no doubt that she's talking about the black race, because she uses the word race, and then later, even if you don't know what sable means, even if you don't know what scornful means, and maybe you do, and maybe you know that this is a suffix, and then you see the word scorn, so you know this is full of scorn. Some view our sable race with full of scorn eye, with a full of scorn eye, with scornful eye. And so race is referring to, in this case, the black race, maybe even black Christians. Some view. So that's her saying some people view. So notice the transition in point of view. Now the transition changes, but interestingly, she says some, and then she uses our sable race. So she is part of that race. And so in this case, could line 5 be referring to both maybe a moral and a moral lesson and social lesson? Perhaps. Again, you decide. I don't really see the religious lesson yet, or not yet, but in that specific line 5, I'm leaning more towards a moral and a social lesson in that one. And then she says in quotations, "Their color." Whose color? Their color is a diabolic dye. So we've got this idea of race and color. And so in this case, their color is a diabolic dye. And thinking about the word diabolic or diabolical, I want to think of like something like Diablo. Think of the devil. Their color is a devil dye. So we've got this idea, being presented in line 6. And so I'm going to go ahead and undo that. Sorry about that. So, and thinking about line 6, is it a moral lesson and religious lesson and social lesson? I mean, I think that's one of those that maybe you could say all 3. So moral, religious, and a social lesson, because the devil is being brought up. So diabolical, referring back to this color, their color. Now she's shifting point of view and now looking at it from another perspective. So she shifts perspective, and it seems like it's a little bit of everything: moral, social, or moral, religious, and social lesson, to keep the ordering that I have up at the top. So moral, religious, and a social lessons here on this one for line 6. And then she says, "Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. So I'm going to put lines 7 and 8 together because, again, they do, and you could argue there's a comma here, and so these two also go together. And so in some respects, if you said lines 5 and 6 were all three, that could work as well. So I'm going to add line 7, and line 8. And thinking about this, remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. So what's really being said here? We've got this idea of, that Negroes, if I take away all these, these areas where the commas are, remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain, and I could take this part out and read it. Remember, Christians, Negroes may be refined and join the angelic train. And so it's like, hey, there is a right, and we have a right to that heaven as well. And we too will be joining that train of angels leading up to the kingdom of heaven. So could we argue moral, religious, and social lessons in this last line? Absolutely. You could say that. Or you could just say, well, maybe I just think it's a moral and religious lesson, and that's fine too. So if you feel like it's moral and religious lesson, let's pretend that you were going on that route. And so you could say that as well. Again, you decide as the writer, but the challenging part will be to defend it. Now, writers, you have to defend what you mean. And so are you starting to understand why allegory is pretty challenging and how to prove that? So if you are getting the sense that our middle school and high school paragraph are almost going to run together in some respects, they definitely are. These are going to be longer paragraphs, no doubt. Longer videos, no doubt. And so let's begin. Now that we have our text evidence and we've thought about this, we want to go back and I almost want to go back before we even begin our middle school paragraph, is thinking about the literary devices that she's using before we go on. So I want to just make a note of a couple literary devices, writers. Bear with me for a moment. Okay, and really it's happening at the end right here. So if you noticed, if you said to yourself, wait a second, Cruz mentioned metaphors and symbolism. And if you picked up on the metaphor here, their color is a diabolic die, a direct comparison using is, or again, was in some way, again, comparing two things directly without using like or as. Color, their color, the black color being compared to diabolic die, then you are on my level, writers. So if you picked up on that metaphor, absolutely. Now take a look at what I'm going to be writing here. So here, did you pick up on the simile? Did you pick up on the symbolism? Did you pick up on the illusion? So if you're picking up on this, then you're understanding, again, how these literary devices within figurative language start to come together to create this allegory. So simile, did you pick up on Negroes black as Cain? So we have, using like or as a comparison, black being compared to Cain. Well, hold on a second. Who is Cain? Oh, snap. I've got an illusion here. I've got a reference to something or someone from the Bible. So here I've got a biblical allusion being referenced. You could also argue that Cain serves as a symbol, a symbolic, cane is symbolic, or even the color black as symbolism, black as cane. Thinking about that from a symbolic standpoint, you may also start to notice again how writers use these devices to give their message, but we have to be present. We have to see those messages, and otherwise they're going to go right over our heads. So if you're picking up again as we're reading along on these ideas, now we can start to go into our paragraph, because not only have we picked up on the moral, religious, and social lessons, but we've also picked up on other literary devices that are being used to then represent this whole work ultimately as an allegory. Thank you so much, Right Writers, for sticking it out so far. So now we will begin our paragraphs. And again, we've taken a lot of time to talk about the moral, religious, social lessons, the literary devices, and we are just going to jump in to our middle school paragraph. When you provide yourself the time to brainstorm and think, then the paragraph becomes much more approachable. It becomes doable. So let's take a look at our middle school paragraph and how we would set this up. Just like, again, every other paragraph, wanting to be direct, wanting to be specific. This time, though, we're using the whole poem, and I will show you how to use that by hitting that tab key and indenting what we have. So in this case, we can say in our middle school paragraph, we want to reference, so Phyllis Wheatley's poem, and now I'm going to go ahead and say her title. And so we're thinking about this on being brought. And as I'm working, again, I hope you're working with me and typing along with me and thinking about what you're going to say and how you're going to set this up. So on being brought from Africa to America represents, and again, I want to make sure, I want my writers to know, where am I going? What am I doing? So I want to make sure that I have that. Phyllis Wheatley's poem on being brought from Africa to America represents an allegory, because again, that's what we're talking about here. That's our literary device, an allegory. Now we briefly explain, we give the definition of what an allegory is. So allegories, I'm going to say reveal, hidden, and thinking about moral, religious, and social lessons. So in this case, I'm going to say allegories can reveal hidden religious, moral, social, and or political messages. We don't need that. Allegories reveal. Let's be more direct on that. Now, so how many stanzas is her poem? It's really only one stanza. So I'm going to go ahead and let the reader know, and then we're going to start with our text evidence, the whole poem. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and say Wheatley's one stanza. Now, rather than saying poem again, I'm going to say work. Wheatley's one stanza work states the following. Or if you're tired of states and want a different word choice, a word that means states, use the word convey. And all of a sudden, middle schoolers, your paragraph just leveled up. And now I'm going to copy and paste the entire poem. So bear with me here while I take this poem. I'm going to hit Control C. I'm going to hit Control V. And now I'm going to take out all of these little notes that I made there. I'm going to take those out so that, again, I have it all set up. Now, in this case, Right Writers, what we would do here, we would indent, or tab. So take your poem here, and what you want to do is hit the tab key for every line. And so by doing that, you no longer have to put quotation marks because your work has been tabbed. And because of that, it lets the reader know, hey, these aren't my words. This is the entire work. This is the entire poem. So I'm just going to shrink this just a little bit. And so we can see the entire work here. Wheatley's one stanza work conveys an allegory. And now we have the poem. And now comes the part where we have to think about, okay, well, what are we going to say? What's our next sentence? Well, we need to talk about her message. And so we need to begin with it. So we can say Wheatley begins her, and then I can start to use this allegorical, using allegory as an adjective, begins her allegorical message. That's just, again, making this word more advanced, adding a suffix, making it an adjective. Wheatley begins her allegorical message in lines 1 through 3. And so in thinking about this in lines 1 through 3, remember, I talked about 1 through 3, this being a religious lesson. Well, what kind of religious lesson? Well, when she basically journeyed, she made a journey from one continent to another, but also had this religious lesson. So this religious journey too. So Wheatley begins her allegorical messages in lines 1 through 3 by, and it's really hers because she said, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught but my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too." Now her period is here. So you could say, well, Cruz, why don't you say lines 1 through 4? And I'm going to say, I'll go with you on that, because really this is her first period. True, she has a colon here, but that's her first period. So perhaps it would be better to take those 4 lines as one unit. So let's say Wheatley begins her allegorical message in lines 1 through 4 by discussing, or even by sharing, her transcontinental, because she went across continents here. So transcontinental, by sharing her transcontinental and religious journey. And maybe if you like to say both, her transcontinental journey and her religious lesson. So we're thinking about lessons. You could say that. I'm going to say her transcontinental and religious journey. And in this case, again, we know this is referring to lines 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you wanted to include this in your paragraph, you could do that. So I could copy this and put this here. But because I have the entire work and I'm technically letting the reader know, hey, lines 1 through 4, you're going to have to look up there and know that I'm meaning lines 1 through 4. You can do that, or you can be a little bit more proactive and make it very straightforward for the reader and have them not go back to the poem. I'm going to leave that up to you. I'm going to make the reader go back and reread that section. So Wheatley begins her allegorical message in lines 1 through 4 by sharing her transcontinental and religious journey. And then I can say, okay, well, what about that? What is she doing there? Well, it's almost like she's letting people know, hey, once I redemption neither sought nor knew. If now she seeks redemption, what essentially does one do when one gives their soul to God and recognizes there's a God and recognize there's a Savior? Well, it's almost like she herself has been saved. So I'm going to say here, Wheatley uses, in this case, she's using that first person, my, and I, uses first person, really, point of view. Are you picking up, right, writers, on all these literary devices that are being revealed as we look at allegory? Um, Essentially, she's letting us know, to let the reader know that she has been saved, or to reveal to the reader that she has been saved. That she has been, you could even say, well, maybe I'm inferring that she's been baptized, that she is part of the religious community, and she is part, or she represents the religious community, or she is part of the religious community. And so I think I'm going to go with that one, and that she has been saved and she is part of the religious community in this case. And we've pretty much covered lines 1 through 4 here, and explaining that the allegory, that she's been saved and she's part of the religious community. And so she reveals a religious message. Wheatley begins her allegorical message, in this case, to reveal that she has been saved and she is part of the religious community. And so it's almost like, Thus, she expresses a religious and moral lesson. Religious, or you can even say, thus, she begins her poem with a religious and moral lesson. And a moral lesson. Thus, she begins her poem with a religious and a moral lesson. Again, proving this allegory. That's what we want to keep doing, going back and proving what we mean. And let's see. But then we talk about, now we got to go back and let's see, up to the top of the poem here. What did we say for lines 5? 5, 6, and 7, and 8, moral, religious, and social lesson. And then almost 5 and 6, a moral and, in this case, moral, religious, and social lessons here, because she says, again, look for the periods. This is one, here's our period right here, right, writers? So we've got it right there. We have, some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. So we've got this idea, and we've got to bring up the metaphor. So let's do that. So in this case, okay, thus she begins her poem with a religious and moral lesson. Then in lines 5 and 6, let's type out 5 and 6. 5 and 6, Wheatley, does she not shift point of view or start to shift perspective? Wheatley begins to shift perspective, and again, to sort of, and even again, bringing up this dialogue, some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. So thinking about that, again, she starts to change, and thinking about the shift perspective. And again, if you've got some and their color, they, them, it's almost like we are something and they are something else. So it's like this idea of these outsiders, like, it's, we again, some view, and let's be honest, I mean, is she talking about Christians, white Christians specifically? Some white Christians view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. So this idea of the other. Then in lines 5 and 6, Wheatley begins to shift perspective and view the world. And again, this is Cruz inferring here. You can change this, right, writers, how you see it. Then in lines 5 and 6, Wheatley begins to shift perspective, or even maybe say shift her allegorical message to a broader, almost to a bigger audience, to a broader, ooh, I like that. Then in lines 5 and 6, Wheatley begins to shift her allegorical message to a broader audience, and specifically to a broader audience. And maybe we can include a fancy dash, or we can include maybe a colon, to a broader audience. White Christians. In this case, some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Then in lines 5 and 6, Wheatley begins to shift her allegorical message to a broader audience. And maybe we can say, instead of saying white Christians, to a broader audience by including dialogue. So quotation marks and dialogue, by including dialogue, which she herself may have heard. She might have heard Christians say this. So Wheatley begins to shift her allegorical message to a broader audience by including dialogue, which she may have heard within her religious circles. Again, and again, we can see we need to bring up that metaphor. Begins to shift her allegorical message to a broader audience by including dialogue which she may have heard within her religious circles, her religious community, within her religious circles. Let's talk about that. Wheatley uses, by using a metaphor, comparing, it's a direct comparison, directly comparing color, and let's go ahead and use quotation marks here, color, or if we wanted to be more specific, we could say their color. I'm going to go with color. By comparing color to a diabolic dye, so to a diabolic dye, by using a metaphor directly comparing color to a diabolic dye, Wheatley understands, or Wheatley is sending, and here is where we maybe begin the religious, moral, and social lessons. So in this case, let's go ahead and say Wheatley is sending Wheatley sends a religious, moral and social lesson to her readers. Essentially, that's what she's doing. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. By using a metaphor directly comparing, by using a metaphor to compare, let's do that. By using a metaphor to compare color to a diabolic dye, Wheatley sends a religious, moral, and social lesson to her readers. Sends yet another allegorical message. And let's say in this case, a religious, moral, and a moral and a social lesson to her readers, or to her audience, because we talked about this idea of an audience. Social lesson to her audience. In this case, a religious, a moral, and a social lesson to her audience. I like that. Then we end. So we're ending. She ends her poem. Finally, let's go ahead and use a different transition word. Finally, she ends her poem, and really they're the last two lines of her poem. So she ends it with a simile, and also you can argue an allusion or symbolism. So in this case, let's think about that. She's basically saying, remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. So the allusion, there's a moral lesson, a religious lesson. The allusion being like, you might compare us to Cain. The allusion being Cain's the one who murdered his brother Abel. Cain is the one who was jealous of Abel. Cain felt as if God favored Abel. Despite all of this, despite the ideas, keep in mind, late 1700s, despite the idea that you may view Negroes black as Cain, that we too, again, are on that train, angel train to heaven, to the kingdom of heaven. So finally, she ends her poem, again, thinking about, she ends her poem with, and let's go with maybe simile and an allusion. So she ends her poem with a simile, and because it's sort of a simile and an allusion at the same time. Finally, she ends her poem with a simile and allusion, and we're going to use this black as Cain. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain. She ends her poem with a simile and an allusion. And let's go ahead and use that text evidence, right, writers? So black as Cain, and I'm going to go ahead and italicize this because just as she did. So thinking about this, okay, finally she ends her poem with a simile and allusion, black as Cain. Why? To basically, again, to continue her allegorical message, because it's religious, moral, and social here, to continue. Let's see. Finally, she ends her poem with a simile and an allusion, black as Cain, to almost like she's making this message concrete, to solidify. So to solidify her allegorical message, finally she ends her poem with a simile, with both a simile and an allusion, black as Cain, to solidify her allegorical message. And so thinking about, well, what is that, again, this simile, allusion, or allegorical message? So this idea that she's reminding her fellow Christians that heaven has a place for Black Christians too. So in this case, I know I use the word finally and we're not ending it, so you can use a different transition word, because some right writers, some of you all may say, wait a second, you said finally, which means you should be ending the paragraph. Well, not necessarily. You can use it sort of as a transition word. In this case, just using the term finally is referring to the end. So to solidify her allegorical message here, Wheatley reminds fellow Christians, really, because that's really her audience. So reminds fellow Christians in this case that heaven, that's really what she's saying here, that heaven has a place for Black Christians too. That heaven reminds fellow Christians that, and maybe that heaven has a place, or that Black Christians reminds fellow Christians that Black Christians have a place in heaven too. Have a place in heaven too. And in this case, in heaven too, here, Wheatley reminds fellow Christians that Black Christians have a place in heaven too. Let's go ahead and take it from the top, right, writers, because we've kind of been going from our notes without really reading the entire work, because we're going to start to wrap it up, our middle school paragraph. And again, I know, like you, right, writers, if you're like, whoa, Cruz, this is pretty big. This is a big one. But again, I hope you understand why this literary device can be very challenging for students, this idea of allegory, because again, you're looking at the work as a whole and you're really starting to deconstruct it. So let's take it from the top. Now, I'm not going to read the poem, so I'm just going to read the top part of the paragraph and then the bottom part. Let's take a look. Phyllis Wheatley's poem on being brought from Africa to America represents an allegory. Allegories reveal hidden religious, moral, social, and/or political messages. Wheatley's one stanza work conveys an allegory, and then we have her poem. Wheatley begins her allegorical message in lines 1 through 4 by sharing her transcontinental and religious journey. Here, Wheatley uses first-person point of view to reveal to the reader that she has been saved and she is part of the religious community. Thus, she begins her poem with a religious and a moral lesson. Then in lines 5 and 6, Wheatley, and instead of saying begins to shift, let's say Wheatley shifts her allegorical message to a broader audience by including dialogue, by using, and maybe we want to say by using quotation marks, to include dialogue, which she may have heard within her religious circles. Then in lines 5 and 6, Wheatley shifts her allegorical message to a broader audience by using quotation marks to include dialogue which she may have heard within her religious circles. So we've covered lines 5 and 6, and now looking at the end, it states, then we go on, by using a metaphor to compare color to a diabolic dye, Wheatley sends yet another allegorical message. In this case, a religious, a moral, and a social lesson to her audience. Okay, that sounds a bit awkward. By using a metaphor to compare color to a diabolic dye, Wheatley sends yet another allegorical message. In this case, several lessons to religious, moral, and social. Let me see that. That sounds a bit awkward. By using a metaphor to compare color to a diabolic dye, Wheatley sends yet another allegorical message. In this case, religious, moral, and social lessons. In this case, religious, moral, and social lessons to her audience. Let's go with that. Finally, she ends her poem with both a simile and an allusion, black as Cain, to solidify her allegorical message. Here, Wheatley reminds, let's say instead of finally, let's go ahead and use then, because it does sound a little bit awkward. Then she ends her poem with both a simile and an allusion, black as Cain, to solidify her allegorical message, or her final allegorical message. Here, Wheatley reminds fellow Christians that Black Christians have a place in heaven too. And in this case, instead of here, let's go with indeed on this one. Indeed, Wheatley reminds fellow Christians that Black Christians have a place in heaven too. Therefore, and we want to start to wrap this up, right, writers? And so we have our, this idea of, this poem as a whole serving as an allegorical message. So therefore, we can say, therefore, her work serves as an allegory to readers. Okay, let's take a look at this last half, right, writers? Thank you again so much for joining Cruz here for this very, very intense video. Wheatley begins her allegorical message in lines 1 through 4 by sharing her transcontinental and religious journey. Here, Wheatley uses first-person point of view to reveal to the reader that she has been saved and she is part of the religious community. Thus, she begins her poem with a religious and a moral lesson. Then in lines 5 and 6, Wheatley shifts her allegorical message to a broader audience by using quotation marks to include dialogue which she may have heard within her religious circles. By using a metaphor to compare color to a diabolic dye, Wheatley sends yet another allegorical message. In this case, religious, moral, and social lessons to her audience. In this case, Wheatley sends yet another allegorical message. In this case, religious, moral, and social lessons to her audience. Then she ends her poem with both a simile and an allusion, black as Cain, to solidify her final allegorical message. Indeed, Wheatley reminds fellow Christians that Black Christians have a place in heaven too. Therefore, her work serves as an allegory to readers. So in this case, I think this can work as a very basic first draft for allegory for middle school. So I'm just going to shrink this ever so slightly so we can see the entire work, and you can see again how much larger this one is than other paragraphs. And again, this is a very basic middle school paragraph looking at allegory. Absolutely, we can fix, tweak, adjust, reconstruct, and we're going to let this sit. And then again, we always want to come back to our work later and make it better. Thank you, middle schoolers, for sticking this one out. All right, next up, our upper level or high school paragraph. Now we're going to be moving into our high school paragraph, and yes, we still have to ask the questions of why. So thinking about, we've done quite a bit, right, writers, and looking at all of this information here. So I'm going to take this text evidence and I'm going to move it down, Control C and Control V, and I'm moving it down, but we still need to ask, there's some more questions and some more ideas that we need to think about for our high school level paragraph. So I'm just going to move this down just a little bit more, and that way we can have this all on one page. And I'm going to expand this a bit larger for our upper level paragraph. And again, just thinking about the why, right, writers? We have to make the time to analyze and think about this. So one of the things, and readers, you may have already seen it, and right, writers, and as a reader, you may have seen, well, she uses these italics and in certain parts, this idea of pagan, savior, Christians, Negroes, and Cain. So in thinking about, why we've already talked about some of the whys in the middle school session, but in this case, let's add on, and we're advancing our thinking here. Why do that? Why change the font? So in this case, I'm going to put font change, or we have this idea of putting things in italics. So why do that? Well, if you think about what she italicized, look at the words she italicized. She italicized pagan. She italicized savior. She italicized Christians, Negroes, and Cain. So she used these italics, and it was certain very specific words. So, again, putting those down, and she put them in capital letters. So pagan, savior, Christians, and again, I'm doing it in the order that she has it in the work. Negroes and Cain. So this is the order in which she has it. And so that even is interesting, the ordering that she's using. Pagan, savior, Christians, Negroes, Cain. So in thinking about that, why do that? Well, she might be doing that to emphasize basically part of to emphasize her audience, maybe, to emphasize certain words. So emphasize certain words to highlight her religious, her spiritual journey, You can say to emphasize certain words to highlight her spiritual journey, in this case, Wheatley. You could argue it could be to emphasize her audience, who she is speaking to emphasize her audience, who she's speaking to. So who she's sending this message, this allegorical message to. If you watch the video on illusion, you see a lot of information about this idea of Cain. And so I want to talk about this allegory through what I would consider, you can call it through allusion, through a biblical allusion. So a biblical allusion, you can consider it, well, there's some symbolism behind it. I'm going to go with this idea of allegory through a biblical allusion, and this idea of, Cain, suffering from internal conflict. He suffered from internal conflict as a character. We can think about, he was jealous of his brother, jealous of his fellow brethren. Very interesting if you think about that. So jealous of his brother, felt that God favored his brother more than him, favored his brother more than him, this idea of favoritism. And then we can think about, the fact that because of this favoritism and jealousy, he murdered his brother Abel. And then that murdering basically led to, to banishment, being banished, being, sort of like this other, being pushed away. So this idea of banishment. So he's banished. And then, if you think about it, you could argue that Cain ends up in, whether it's a symbolic hell or a metaphorical hell. We're talking about religion here. So Cain ends up in either in a symbolic or and/or metaphorical hell because of this murder that happens. So you can think about it as Cain ending up in this metaphorical hell or a symbolic hell. And so in this case, thinking about this, we've got this simile, we've got this simile here, we've got symbolism, this illusion, and we've got this metaphor. And so now we have a little bit more information. We've leveled up, no doubt, upper level paragraph, high school paragraph here. We've leveled up our thinking to make this paragraph even richer, make it more complex. That's what right writing is about. So right writers, we are on this writing journey, on this train, on this journey to, again, level up what we have. So we're going to take absolutely for our high school and upper level paragraph for this literary device. So I'm going to say upper level paragraph and high school paragraph. No doubt we are using the middle school version, but we're going to expand on it quite a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and move this down to set ourselves up here for success, because I can assure you this is going to end up taking probably an entire Google Doc page. So moving up to the top, I'm grabbing all of this here. And again, this is about doing things the deeper way on this channel. That's what this is about, right, writers? It's about going deeper and going beyond the surface to reveal more. And so now I can move this down. I'm going to borrow this, Control C, and then I'm going to move this down to Control V here so I can sort of see it and start to put it in where we have some spots. Because we wrote a pretty decent first level draft in our middle school version, but now we want to, again, level it up by including this part right here. And again, this idea of, let's take it from the top and see what we have. Phyllis Wheatley's poem on being brought from Africa to America represents an allegory. Allegories reveal hidden religious, moral, social, and or political messages. Wheatley's one stanza work conveys the allegory or conveys an allegory. And then we have her poem. Wheatley begins her allegorical message in lines 1 through 4 by sharing her transcontinental and religious journey. I like it so far, and we've analyzed pretty well. Here, Wheatley uses first person point of view, part of analysis, to reveal to the reader. I think we can take to the reader out, to reveal that she has been saved and she is part of the religious community. Thus, that she is part of the, instead of saying, let's go with it, let's go with religious community, let's change this to spiritual journey. So we can kind of level up our vocab here and just change it, some synonyms here, and spiritual journey. Here, Wheatley uses first person point of view to reveal that she has been saved and she is part of the religious community. Thus, she begins her poem with a religious and a moral lesson. Then, in lines 5 and 6, Wheatley shifts her allegorical message to a broader audience by using quotation marks to include dialogue which she may have heard within her religious circles, by using a metaphor to compare color to a diabolic die. Wheatley sends yet another allegorical message, in this case, religious, moral, and social lessons to her Christian audience. I think I want to put Christian in that part. To her Christian audience. Again, so far, so good. And you may be wondering, when are we going to talk about this part? Well, I think I'm going to save this for the very end because, again, Cain is mentioned at the end. We've got 3 italics, 3 changes of font at the end. And so I think that's where we're going to put that in. So then she ends her poem with both a simile and an allusion. All right, so we're going to borrow this right here, and we're going to end up using this in this part here. Then she ends her poem with both a simile and an allusion. Black as Cain, to solidify her final allegorical message. Indeed, Wheatley understands, let's say indeed Wheatley understands that, remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. Indeed, Wheatley, I'm going to say directly addresses, then she ends her poem. Let's go ahead and use this whole section. I think I'm going to use the whole thing because it just makes sense to do that. So I'm going to take this part out and I'm going to go ahead and use that whole message. Then, and I'm going to go ahead and use that line here. Then she ends her poem with both a simile and an allusion. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use that / Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. To solidify, and I'm going to go ahead and use ellipses here. To solidify her final allegorical message. Indeed, Wheatley directly addresses, let's say Wheatley addresses her audience in a direct way. Remember, Christians, and it's almost like we can add a you there. Remember, you Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. So indeed, Wheatley addresses her audience in a direct way to remind fellow Christians that black Christians have a place in heaven too. And in this case, again, a biblical, let's see, then she ends her poem with both a simile and let's go ahead and say a biblical allusion to solidify her final allegorical message. Indeed, Whitley addresses her audience in a direct way to remind fellow Christians that even though they may view, her kind as or her race or her kind as other, as the other, they may view her kind as, or they may categorize, almost, they're putting it into categories here. They may categorize her kind in a negative way. And again, so this idea of black as Cain, even though they may categorize her kind in a negative way, and even through, again, a negative story, even though indeed Wheatley addresses her audience in a direct way to remind fellow Christians that even though they may categorize her kind in a negative way, Black Christians have a place in heaven too. And so in this case, this isn't really working. Some of this ideas that I came up with, it's not really working in the paragraph, so I'm not going to use that. But I think we're going to use this one at the end here. In a negative way, Black Christians have a place in heaven too. Therefore, her work, including even the words she chooses to italicize, her work, including the words she chooses to italicize for emphasis. And again, and maybe I'm going to go ahead and remind the readers, including the words she chooses to italicize for emphasis. And let's remind the readers what those words were. We've got pagan, savior, Christians, Negroes, and Cain. Control C, Control V. And I'm going to take that out. And I'm going to put this in quotations here. And just kind of leave it like that. Let's go with pagan. Savior. Let's spell savior correctly. Savior the way she did, because I think she has it I-O-U-R. I-O-U-R. Christians, Negroes, Cain, for emphasis. Therefore, her work, including the words she chooses to italicize for emphasis, her work, including or even the words she chooses to including the words, let's go with including the words she chooses, she italicizes for emphasis, including the words she italicizes for emphasis. Pagan, savior, Christians, Negroes, Cain serve as an allegory to her audience. I'm going to go back to she chooses to italicize for emphasis, pagan, savior, Christians, Negroes, Cain, and I'm going to go ahead and italicize these because these are all italicized here. So I want to do that, including those, but I don't want the italics to be in italic, or the ellipses to be in italics. So I'm going to take that out. And so thinking about this, because again, I want to bring that up because I think that's really interesting that she, those words that she chose also emphasize something, serve as an allegory to her audience, serve as an allegory to a broader audience. Therefore, her work, including the words she chooses to italicize for emphasis, pagan, savior, Christians, Negroes, Cain, serve as an allegory, as a poetic allegory to a broader audience. Ooh, I like that. I like the way that's rolling. Right, writers. Okay, let's go ahead and we're going to shrink this just a little bit and then we'll look at it as a whole. Again, I apologize. Some of the stuff, some of the analysis, not stuff, but analysis that we chose, that we did not use, and that's okay. Sometimes that happens. So I'm just rereading for flow, right, writers. Phyllis Wheatley's poem, Being Brought from Africa to America, represents an allegory. Allegories reveal hidden religious, moral, social, and/or political messages. Wheatley's one stanza work conveys an allegory. Then we've got the work itself. Wheatley begins her allegorical message in lines 1 through 4 by sharing her transcontinental and spiritual journey. Here, Wheatley uses first-person point of view to reveal that she has been saved, and she is part of the religious community. Thus, she begins her poem with a religious and a moral lesson. Then, in lines 5 and 6, Wheatley shifts her allegorical message to a broader audience by using quotation marks to include dialogue which she may have heard within her religious circles. By using a metaphor to compare color to a diabolic die, Wheatley sends yet another allegorical message. In this case, religious, moral, and social lessons to her Christian audience. Then she sends, I have then and then. I have then up here and then up here. So I'm going to change this to later. Later, she ends her poem with both a simile and a biblical allusion. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train, to solidify her final allegorical message. Indeed, Wheatley addresses her audience in a direct way to remind fellow Christians that even though they may categorize her kind in a negative way, Black Christians will have a place in heaven too. Even though they may categorize her kind in a negative way, Black Christians will still have a place in heaven too. Therefore, her work, including the words she chooses to italicize for emphasis, pagan, savior, Christians, Negroes, Cain, serve as a poetic allegory to a broader audience. Actually, I just want to say serve as a poetic category. Therefore, her work, including the words she chooses to italicize for emphasis, pagan, savior, Christians, Negroes, Cain, serve as a complete poetic allegory. As a poetic allegory. Let's go with that, right, writers? For first draft for our upper level high school paragraph. Hey, not too shabby, right, writers? Now I'm going to take all this away, all that work that we did. So I'm going to Control-C it, and I'm going to Control-V it way down here. I'm going to move it, and then I'm going to move our high school paragraph, upper level paragraph, up right next to our middle school paragraph, and take a look at the difference in this allegory, in this literary device, and seeing an upper level high school paragraph versus a middle school paragraph version. Now, in this case, I want to keep them on their own page, and I'm going to shrink to tiny, 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 tiny. And so that way we can really begin to see how this looks on paper. And so I apologize, right, writers, but you can really start to see, okay, zooming, we're at 33% here, the difference in length between the middle school and the upper level high school paragraph. So here's our one pager for middle school. And then we have, I almost want to see if I had Savior in here. I don't think I did, so I'm okay with that because I wanted to make sure I spelled that correctly in this one. But we've got our middle school, and then we've got our high school upper level paragraph. So did we expand? Did we go into more detail? Yes, absolutely, we did. So, Right Riders, thank you so much for joining me in this amazing journey with Phyllis Wheatley on being brought from Africa to America. Thank you so much for sticking it out and enjoying this poem written in the late 1700s. Thank you to the Poetry Foundation for, again, providing us with this work so that we can begin to, again, deconstruct this wonderful allegory and go deeper with what we are reading. Thank you again, Right Riders. Love you guys. I appreciate you subscribing to this channel. I hope that this ensures your success and that you feel more comfortable, more confident with Allegory. Love you guys. Take care. Bye-bye.